Hey guys! Tonight we drift into a sunlit courtyard where marble columns throw long, lazy shadows, and the air smells faintly of thyme and olive oil warming under the midday heat. In front of you, Apollo is lounging like someone who has never heard of a bad hair day, his golden curls behaving as if a light breeze exists solely for them. You're squinting at a scene that feels unusual, even for a god. Because instead of holding a lyre, he's cradling a beehive. Not just any beehive. This one is carved from pale cedar, polished smooth, with a tiny bronze sun emblem on top, as if the bees might forget whose house they're living in without the branding. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Not in the stung to death sense, although that's a possibility, but because you're about to witness the kind of slow, meandering adventure that could lull even the most caffeinated mind straight to sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. It's always oddly satisfying to see where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You watch as the man, well, god, of the sun examines his new gift. It's from a far-off admirer, some priest from the island of Thasos who claims the bees there hum in a pitch-perfect D major. Apollo tilts the hive, listening, as though he can confirm that on the spot. He nods approvingly, because of course he can. In the background, the temple attendants are whispering. Historically speaking, gifts to gods weren't always this practical. Sure, statues, gold tripods, or ceremonial robes were the usual fare, but a working beehive? That's like bringing a celebrity chef a crate of onions. Useful, yes, but bold. The cedar slats smell resinous under the heat, the wax inside faintly sweet. You notice one bee has ventured out, hovering near Apollo's cheek. He doesn't flinch. Instead, he smiles as though the insect has just complimented his jawline. "They like me," he says, simply, in the same tone someone might remark about bread being warm. You step closer, careful not to startle the bees. This is ancient Greece, after all, and while you don't exactly have modern protective gear, you do have the benefit of sandals and an irrational confidence in your ability to sidestep anything with wings. There's a quirk to this scene, one you file away mentally. In some ancient traditions, bees were seen as messengers between worlds. A few scholars even argue that Apollo's own oracle, the Pythia, may have been metaphorically tied to bees in early myths, though historians still argue whether that's literal or just poetic shorthand. Either way, the symbolism isn't lost on you. This could be the start of a whole new, well, side hustle feels too modern a term, but it's not far off. Apollo's expression shifts to that of someone hatching a plan. "We'll keep them," he announces, "right here in Delphi. They'll thrive." You glance around at the sun-bleached stone and the crowds of petitioners waiting for oracles. It's not exactly a quiet meadow. Still, you know better than to question a god's landscaping choices. "Of course, my lord," you say, trying to match his regal cadence, though it comes out more like a polite shrug. The truth is, ancient Greek cities weren't strangers to beekeeping. Bees were critical for both honey and wax, honey as the only widespread sweetener, and wax for candles, seals, and even a primitive form of waterproofing. You think briefly about how honey was also used medicinally, sometimes mixed with herbs to treat wounds. This makes the gift not just whimsical, but genuinely valuable. A temple servant shuffles forward with a small clay jar, clearly part of the package deal. Apollo uncorks it, and the scent that escapes is so rich it's almost floral. "Thasian honey," he murmurs, as though that explains everything. You take a mental note that, centuries later, people will still rank Thasian honey among the best in the Mediterranean. "Help me find them a home," Apollo says suddenly, and you realize you've just been conscripted into divine beekeeping duty. He hands you the hive as casually as someone passing a bread basket, and it's heavier than you expect. Warm, too, with the faint vibration of life inside. The bees hum, a constant low thrum, like the sound of distant waves heard through a wall. It's oddly calming, though you keep your eyes forward in case one decides to test your personal space. You step away from the temple's main steps, weaving through a cluster of worshippers who part without complaint. Nobody's about to block Apollo's path, even if he's carrying a box of insects. He walks beside you, speaking in that effortlessly smooth tone that could make a lecture on taxation sound like a ballad. "I've sung to kings and fought in wars," he says, "but perhaps it is time I learn patience from smaller teachers." The phrasing catches you off guard. There's a humility in it that feels rare. You're tempted to ask if this is just another divine whim, like the time he decided to personally paint every sunrise over the Aegean for a week. But you remember the way he looked at that first bee, as though genuinely charmed. Maybe this is something else, something steadier. At the far end of the courtyard, you stop under a trellis where grapevines twist into lazy spirals overhead. It's cooler here, the air tinged with the smell of ripening fruit. Apollo considers the spot, tilts his head, and finally shakes it. Too shaded, he decides. They'll need the full sun. So the search will continue. You can already feel the gentle pull of the next step, choosing a meadow somewhere beyond the temple walls. But for now, you adjust your grip on the hive, the bees hum steady in your arms, and follow the god of the sun toward whatever golden field he has in mind. You follow Apollo down the winding stone path that snakes away from the temple and toward the open hills. The hive in your arms gives off a gentle, living vibration, and the bees inside shift in little waves, like they're holding a meeting about whether they approve of relocation day. The air here is warmer, the sunlight somehow brighter than it was in the courtyard, which makes sense given that you're walking next to the guy responsible for all daylight. Ahead, the landscape opens into a quilt of rolling meadows and rocky outcrops. Wildflowers spread in lazy drifts, their colors softened under the noon glare. Pale blues, buttery yellows, and those deep crimson poppies that always seem to lean dramatically, as if aware they're being painted. Somewhere far off, a shepherd calls to his goats, the sound carrying like a warm breeze over stone. Apollo pauses at the edge of a small rise, scanning the horizon with the same seriousness he might use to plot a military campaign. They'll need shelter from strong winds, he muses, but nothing to block the sun's blessing. He says blessing the way a landlord says rent, as if it's non-negotiable. Historically speaking, ancient Greek beekeepers would choose spots sheltered by walls or hedges, often near flowering plants and a clean water source. You glance around and spot a little trickle of a stream winding its way between olive trees, glinting silver. Perfect, you think. Then you notice a cluster of large white boulders beside it, and, call it superstition, you wonder if the bees will appreciate a natural landmark to orient themselves. Apollo, on the other hand, is distracted by the aesthetics. "That hill," he says, pointing to a rise dotted with wild thyme. "The scent alone will make the honey sing." You trudge after him, careful not to jostle the hive too much. The path narrows, lined on one side by low shrubs that snag at your tunic. Somewhere in there, a cicada starts its shrill, lazy song. You briefly consider whether bees and cicadas ever get into turf wars, but decide it's a question for later. When you crest the hill, the view makes even Apollo cause. From here, you can see the valley spread out in layers, rows of olive trees, scattered grazing sheep, and in the far distance, a thin blue smear of the Gulf of Corinth. The thyme at your feet releases a fragrance every time you step, filling the air with that warm, peppery sweetness that's both calming and a little hunger-inducing. This, Apollo says with finality, is where we will build their palace. Palace, not hive stand, not apiary. Palace. You resist the urge to ask whether the bees will get a throne room. Setting the hive down in the shade of a tall rock, you stretch your arms, feeling the absence of its gentle weight. Apollo crouches, inspecting the ground like a gardener, brushing aside small stones. They will need space to fly freely, he says, and flowers close enough for short trips. A tired bee is an unproductive bee. It's almost a historical fact disguised as a quip. Ancient sources do note that placement close to nectar sources increases honey yield. Will you play music for them? You ask, only half joking. Apollo grins. Of course, everyone works better with a little rhythm. He doesn't elaborate on whether the rhythm will be lyre-based or a cappella bee-themed humming. The bees have grown louder inside the hive, the warm sun coaxing them toward activity. A few slip out through the small opening, circling in quick reconnaissance loops before darting off toward the thyme patch. You watch them, oddly proud, as if you had anything to do with their flight patterns. Apollo stands, brushing dust from his tunic. We'll need to mark the boundaries, he says. Let no goat wander in, and no curious child disturb them. You imagine the first curious child who tries and fails to borrow some honey, and the lesson they'll learn. Probably a quick one. There's a quirky tidbit you recall from somewhere. In certain rural Greek traditions, beekeepers would actually talk to their bees, announcing births, deaths, or other major events, as though the insects were part of the household. You picture Apollo solemnly informing the hive about his latest song contest with the muses, and the thought makes you smile. As you and Apollo walk the perimeter of the chosen spot, he picks up a fallen olive branch and uses it to sketch a rough map in the dirt, where the hive will sit, where additional ones might go later. A proper apiary, he says, like a man planning to franchise. The sun has shifted just enough that the shadows are longer, cooler, the thyme scent mingling now with the sharper green of nearby olive leaves. Apollo squints toward the stream, judging its distance. We'll build them a shallow basin, he says, so they may drink without danger. You think about the tiny bee lifeguards that exist in your imagination now, but keep that to yourself. When you glance back, the hive looks strangely at home already, its cedar sides glowing faintly in the sunlight, bees slipping in and out like commuters at a busy train station. This might actually work. Apollo seems to think so too. He rests a hand lightly on the top, not pressing, just feeling the hum. Tomorrow, we'll begin their training, he says, with the same casualness someone might use for, tomorrow we'll go to the market. You decide not to ask what training entails. Instead, you take in the meadow, the sound of the stream, the steady drone of cicadas, and that constant, velvety hum from the hive. You can already feel the day's heat beginning to soften into evening warmth. Whatever comes next, sticky hands, bee chases, divine musical performances, this is the right place to start. The next morning, you're woken by sunlight so warm it feels like someone draped a heated wool cloak over you, which, to be fair, is possible. Apollo is in the habit of turning even an average sunrise into a personal spotlight. You squint through the pale gold light and see him already standing by the hive, hands clasped behind his back, watching the small doorway like a general inspecting the barracks at dawn. The air is cool still, the kind of morning chill that makes your skin prickle, but it's thick with the scent of thyme and wild mint crushed underfoot. The bees are beginning their day, emerging in slow, cautious dribbles at first, then in larger bursts. Their wings catch the light in flashes, tiny sunbursts that vanish as quickly as they appear. Apollo glances over his shoulder at you. They seem curious. His tone is one part admiration, one part owner of a new pet who isn't sure if it likes him yet. You wander closer, crouching so you're at hive eye level. Bees crawl purposefully along the cedar surface, their legs dusted in the faintest yellow pollen. One hovers inches from your nose, inspecting you like a customs officer. You hold still, trying to radiate the energy of someone entirely uninteresting. Historically, the Greeks respected bees deeply. Honey was not only a sweetener, but also a key offering to the gods. Some temples even had their own hives, tended by designated keepers. A fringe tidbit comes to mind too. Certain ancient writers claimed bees were born from the carcasses of dead bulls, a belief called bougonia. Scholars still argue whether this was based on misunderstood observations or just poetic metaphor gone rogue. You make a mental note not to mention this to Apollo. He's already too proud of these bees to stomach the idea they might prefer bovine housing. Apollo extends one finger toward the entrance hole. A bee lands on it, her tiny feet shifting like someone testing a new dance floor. "See?" he says, eyes bright. "They know I am the sun." You refrain from pointing out that bees are naturally sun-oriented. Why ruin his moment? The first sting happens about 5 minutes later. Not to you, Apollo. One particularly impatient worker decides his golden aura is no excuse for blocking the doorway and jabs him right on the knuckle. He yelps, more in surprise than pain, then laughs. "Assertive," he says, shaking out his hand. "I like her." You hand him a small clay cup of water you brought from the stream. Maybe keep your hands a little farther back. You both spend the next hour just watching. The bees fan their wings at the entrance to ventilate the hive. Others zip off toward the far side of the meadow, where patches of yellow broom and white clover wait like open buffets. The air fills with that low, steady hum, less a sound, more a texture you can feel in your bones. Apollo starts narrating their movements as if commentating a sport. Ah, there goes the bold explorer, taking the thyme route over the western ridge. And here, the industrious gatherer. Note her efficient takeoff. His voice is so calm, so amused, that you almost forget he's the same figure who once shot 100 arrows in a single battle. You ask whether he plans to name them. "Not all," he says, "but perhaps the queens." Then, lowering his voice, "They do have queens, right?" You nod, suppressing a smile. Even gods need reassurance sometimes. The sun rises higher, and with it, the bees' activity ramps up. They spiral out in widening arcs, tracing invisible maps in the air. You think of how, in reality, bees use the waggle dance to tell others where to find food, a fact known to modern science, but hinted at in ancient observations. Apollo, naturally, believes they're simply enjoying the music of the world. By midday, you've both shifted into the shade of the tall boulder, sitting cross-legged in the grass. The hum from the hive becomes background music, blending with the faint splash of the stream and the rustle of olive leaves. It's hypnotic. "This," Apollo says, quietly, "is better than the lyre." You glance at him, surprised. "Better?" He nods. "The lyre plays for the moment. But this?" He gestures at the hive. This plays for eternity." A bee drifts lazily between you, circling as if checking to see if you're paying attention. And you are, more than you expected to be. Every detail feels amplified, the faint vibration of the ground beneath you, the tang of wild mint in the air, the tiny glint of a bee's wing as it catches the sun. It occurs to you that this is the real first meeting, not just Apollo seeing the bees, but you learning how to be still enough to let them accept you. When the shadows begin to tilt, Apollo rises and dusts himself off. "They're settled," he says, "but they will need guidance." The way he says it, you're not entirely sure whether he means the bees or himself. Either way, you follow him down toward the stream to fetch more water, already wondering what guidance will look like when it comes from the god of the sun.
By the time you return from the stream with the clay jug balanced against your hip, there's a faint shimmer in the air, like heat haze, except it's accompanied by an unmistakable lilt of harp strings. You round the thyme-covered boulder and find the source, not Apollo, but 9 women arranged in a loose semicircle around the hive, the Muses. They are predictably radiant. Each of them wears her own variation of a flowing chiton, hair braided or crowned with flowers, and each is holding something: lyres, flutes, scrolls, and one suspiciously large amphora you suspect is already half empty. Apollo stands among them, hands raised in a sort of hear-me-out gesture, though the Muses clearly don't need much convincing to join any event that promises entertainment. "You've heard about my bees," Apollo says as you set down the water jug. He's got that tone people get when they think they're being subtle about bragging. Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, steps forward first. "They must be given names worthy of their labors," she declares, already pulling a stylus from her belt. You can practically hear Apollo's pride inflate. "Music will keep them calm," adds Euterpe, muse of flutes, already raising her instrument. A light, meandering melody drifts into the air, and a few bees actually pause mid-flight, as if they've been caught in a daydream. Historically speaking, music and bees have crossed paths before. Some ancient sources claimed that piping could encourage bees to swarm or settle. Modern beekeepers might call this smoke and patience, but clearly the Muses prefer a more lyrical approach. Then Thalia, muse of comedy, leans in toward the hive entrance and says, "Knock, knock." The bees ignore her entirely. "Tough crowd," she mutters. You catch Erato, muse of love poetry, sprinkling flower petals in a neat ring around the hive, murmuring something about setting the right romantic tone. She insists bees will work harder if they feel appreciated. Terpsichore, the muse of dance, suggests choreographing their flight patterns into a sky ballet. Apollo nods along to all of it, smiling in that way that says he's picturing this becoming an official temple ritual. You, however, are fairly certain the bees don't need a 9-act artistic residency to make honey. Melpomene, muse of tragedy, sighs dramatically and warns that the bees must be prepared for the great storms of fate. She produces a scrap of black cloth from nowhere and drapes it solemnly over a nearby rock, as though that somehow protects the hive. The fringe tidbit that pops into your mind is that some beekeepers in later centuries would literally dress their hives in cloth during cold weather, though whether it ever made a difference is debatable. Historians still argue whether it was practical insulation or pure superstition. You're not sure if the bees are amused, but they certainly seem curious. Several circle above the group, their tiny shadows flickering over the muses' dresses. Clio, the muse of history, points to them and begins reciting a list of every known instance of beekeeping in Greek records. You half listen, noting that she starts with mentions from the island of Crete, where honey was used in offerings to the goddess Potnia in Minoan times. Meanwhile, Polyhymia has knelt in the grass, eyes closed, as if communing with the hive through sheer spiritual focus. She doesn't speak for a long moment, then opens her eyes and says, "They're hungry." You're inclined to believe her, given the sudden flurry of bees heading toward the thyme. The amphora, courtesy of Urania, muse of astronomy, turns out to contain diluted wine. For the humans, she clarifies when you glance at the bees nervously. She claims the mixture is perfect for celestial planning and starts sketching a constellation map in the dirt, linking the hive to the Pleiades. Apollo is charmed. You suspect the wine is stronger than advertised. You stand there with your arms folded, watching this unfold like some divine committee meeting that has spiraled off topic. Still, you have to admit the energy is pleasant. The bees' hum blends with music, laughter, and the occasional overly dramatic sigh. It's almost hypnotic. Apollo finally claps his hands once. "Enough for now," he says gently. They are still settling in. The muses nod, gathering their instruments and scrolls. One by one, they drift back down the hill, leaving behind the faint trail of perfume, laughter, and impractical advice. As the last one disappears into the olive grove, Apollo turns to you. "Well?" "They're, very committed to the arts," you say diplomatically. He chuckles. "They mean well, and who knows, perhaps a little music will sweeten the honey." He says it so casually, you almost believe bees could compose symphonies. The meadow feels quieter now, though the scent of crushed thyme still hangs in the air where the muses had stood. The bees return to their steady rhythm, undisturbed by the grand visions just presented to them. You can't help thinking they might prefer it that way.
By late afternoon, Apollo has decided that divine advice, while entertaining, won't teach him much about actual beekeeping. "We need a mortal," he says, as though announcing a revolutionary new concept. "Someone who knows bees the way a sailor knows the wind." Which is how you find yourself following him along a dusty track that winds downhill toward a cluster of stone houses. The air changes as you descend, warmer, heavier, with the scent of baked earth and sheep wool. Somewhere nearby, a loom clacks steadily, and the faint sound of children shouting drifts in and out on the breeze. You eventually stop outside a modest home with a weathered olive tree leaning protectively over it. Its branches creak softly in the wind, scattering silvery leaves across the packed dirt yard. Leaning against the doorway is a man so old he looks like he's been carved directly from olive wood. His skin is darkened from decades of sun, his beard a wiry silver cloud. "This," Apollo says in a low voice, "is Phaedon. They say he can speak to bees." Historically, you know, village beekeepers were repositories of generations' worth of local knowledge: when to move hives, how to protect them from wasps, which flowers make the richest honey. A fringe tidbit floats to mind. In some parts of the ancient world, beekeepers were buried with a portion of their honeycomb, perhaps to sweeten their journey to the afterlife. Historians still argue whether this was a symbolic offering or a practical snack for the road. Phaedon eyes you both without much expression. "You've come about the hives," he says, not a question. His voice is deep, with the rough edge of someone used to speaking over wind and livestock. Apollo, ever the charmer, smiles in that way that mortals either swoon or get suspicious. "I've recently acquired a colony," he says, "and I wish to learn their ways." The old man doesn't swoon. He spits neatly into the dust and says, "You wish to learn their ways? Then you will stand still." Without another word, he shuffles toward the side of his house, motioning for you to follow. There, in a sunny patch, are a dozen hives, simple clay tubes stacked horizontally, each with a small entrance hole. They look nothing like Apollo's polished cedar box, but the bees seem content, moving in and out with purposeful ease. Phaedon stands between the hives like a priest before his congregation. "You watch them," he says. "You listen. You learn when they are angry, when they are tired, when they are ready." Apollo nods solemnly, as though receiving sacred law. You glance at him, half expecting him to whip out a lyre and serenade the insects, but he keeps his hands to himself. The old man points to a bee hovering in front of its hive. "See how she moves, slow. She is tasting the air. She decides if it is safe." His tone has the cadence of ritual. Then he points to another, zipping away in a straight, unwavering line. "This one has work to do. She knows the way." You stand quietly, letting the rhythm of the bees sink in. The hum is different here than in Apollo's meadow. lower, more even, like a well-tuned instrument. Phaedon's eyes follows each bee with unhurried patience, and you realized that's what he's really teaching, stillness. Many gods, Phaedon says suddenly, come to men with gifts. Few stay to tend them. His gaze sharpens, landing squarely on Apollo. There's no malice, just the blunt honesty of someone who has seen too many grand promises drift away like smoke. Apollo takes it in without flinching. "Then I will stay," he says simply. Phaedon considers this, then motions toward his house. "Wait here." He disappears inside, returning moments later with a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside is a square of honeycomb so fresh it glistens in the sun. "For your bees," he says, pressing it into Apollo's hands. The idea surprises you. Feeding bees honey from elsewhere seems unusual. But maybe it's symbolic, a way to link colonies together through shared sweetness. You tuck the thought away to ask about later. As you prepare to leave, Phaedon fixes Apollo with one last look. "They are not yours," he says. You follow Apollo back up the path, the honeycomb bundle cradled carefully in his arms. He walks slower now, thoughtful, as if Phaedon's words are still settling somewhere deep. When you reach the meadow again, the bees are already out, spiraling above the thyme in lazy loops. Apollo sets the honeycomb gently beside the hive, and for a moment we both just watch. A few bees land on it, exploring its waxy hexagons with delicate antennae. "They're curious," you say. Apollo smiles faintly. "So am I."
The morning of the first harvest arrives warmer than usual, the sun climbing quickly into a cloudless sky. You're up early, partly because Apollo insisted you must catch the bees before they finished their morning songs, and partly because curiosity has been buzzing in your head all night. The hive smells richer today, deep, warm, and unmistakably sweet. That cedar note you first noticed is still there, but now it's laced with something heavier, like sunlight distilled into gold. Apollo is already crouched by the hive, sleeves rolled up, holding a shallow bronze bowl. "Today," he says, "we take our share." You try to sound casual, but your voice betrays a little awe. "Do we just open it?" Apollo grins, gently, always gently. He runs a hand over the cedar as if smoothing the fur of a skittish animal. A few bees crawl over his fingers, seemingly unbothered. Historically speaking, honey collection in ancient Greece wasn't so different from what you're about to do, though most beekeepers used ceramic hives and smoked the bees with smoldering herbs to calm them. A quirky tidbit you recall, some sources mention using dried cow dung as a slow-burning fuel for smoke. You silently hope Apollo doesn't decide that's aesthetic. Historians still argue whether such smoke actually pacified bees or simply drove them temporarily out of the hive. Instead, Apollo has chosen fresh thyme and sage set in a small clay burner. The fragrant smoke drifts in lazy spirals, curling into the hive entrance. The bee's tone changes almost instantly, less sharp, more a muted murmur. He lifts the lid carefully. You lean in and are hit by the scent, intense honey warmth, the waxy tang of comb, and a faint floral echo of every plant in the meadow. The interior is a golden labyrinth, hexagons glistening, bees stepping aside but not fleeing entirely. Apollo slides a small bronze knife into the comb and lifts a dripping section into the bowl. The honey oozes slowly, thick and luminous, catching every scrap of sunlight. You can hear the soft, sticky sound as it pulls free, like syrup parting from a spoon. Your first job is to hold the bowl steady while he works. Simple enough, until a bee lands right on the rim, watching you like a guard at a bank vault. You freeze. The bee flicks her wings, almost in slow motion, then wanders away to inspect Apollo's sleeve instead. The first few combs come out clean, their hexagons perfect, capped with thin white wax. But then there's chaos. One comb breaks mid-lift,
splattering honey across Apollo's hand. A bee immediately lands to investigate, then another. Soon, 3 bees are engaged in what looks suspiciously like a taste test. Is this normal, you ask, trying not to move too much? Apollo chuckles. Everything is normal when you work with bees. You simply adapt. His tone makes it sound like a philosophy more than a beekeeping tip. The work is slow. Between the cutting, lifting, and gently shooing bees, you lose track of time. The sun climbs higher, the thyme scent thickens in the warm air, and the bowl grows heavy with honey. Your hands are sticky up to the wrists, and at least twice you've had to brush ants off your sandals. Finally, Apollo sets down the knife. "Enough for today," he says, as though declaring the end of a battle. The hive still hums, a little restless, but intact, and you can almost sense the bees already planning repairs. You both carry the bowl to the flat rock by the boulder. Apollo dips a finger into the golden pool and tastes it, closing his eyes like a man savoring a symphony. "Sweet," he says, but with a note of thyme that lingers. You do the same. It's almost too rich, floral, earthy, and somehow warm even though it's raw. You realize this is more than food. It's a map of the meadow itself. Every flower and herb condensed into a single taste. Then comes the sticky cleanup. Apollo rinses his hands in the stream, the water swirling gold for a moment before carrying the sweetness away. You follow, the cool current a relief after the heat and effort. As you sit in the shade to rest, Apollo holds up the bowl to the light. "This," he says, "is the sun's labor, twice removed. First through the flowers, then through the bees." You can't argue with that. And as the bees return to their routines, the hum feels like a quiet approval of the exchange.
You carry the bronze bowl of honey like a sacred planet, both hands steady, knees doing that careful bent kneed walk people use when they're balancing soup. Apollo strolls beside you with the relaxed confidence of someone who knows the sun won't set until he says so. The path curves from the thyme-bright meadow toward Delphi, where marble glints among cypress shadows, and the sacred way climbs in switchbacks like a ribbon of stone. The air is cooler near the terraces, touched by wind from the mountains and a faint resin from laurel leaves. Presentation matters, Apollo murmurs, and you realize he's in performance mode, the kind that makes poets swoon and kings adjust their crowns. He ties a simple strip of linen around the bowl as a ribbon, presses a small sun seal into a dab of softened wax, and tucks a thyme sprig at the rim. Rustic charm meet divine branding. You can practically hear the muses giving standing ovations from somewhere off stage. Euterpe is probably playing a flute solo just for the garnish. As you reach the lower steps, the world takes on that particular hush that hangs over Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. Not silence exactly, but a respectful thinning of ordinary noise. You pass votive statues, their bronze surfaces dappled in leaf shadow, and treasuries with facades like orderly storybooks. A line of petitioners waits along the sacred way, hands full of laurel, little jars of oil, folded questions. A boy with a goatskin water bag tries to peek into your honey bowl. You tilt it just enough for him to see his reflection in the amber surface. He grins, revealing a gap-toothed smile, and darts back to his family. Purify first, a temple attendant reminds you, with affectionate sternness, as if you're regulars who sometimes forget the dress code. You nod and follow Apollo to the Castalian spring, where water spills over stone into a shallow basin. The splash is bright and cold. You rinse your hands and the bowl's base, then dab a little water at your temples. Historically speaking, visitors to Delphi did purify themselves at this spring before approaching the oracle, a habit as practical as it was pious. You resist the urge to ask whether the dress code also includes business casual with laurel. When you return to the temple steps, the attendant gestures you inward. The hall breathes cool and dim, smelling of incense, laurel, and the mild chalk of fresh scrubbed stone.
You've entered a place that is simultaneously public and secret, a stage and a sanctum. Somewhere below, in the Adyton, the Pythia will be taking her seat upon the tripod, that three-legged emblem that looks like it could hold a cooking pot as easily a conversation with destiny. Historians still argue whether the Pythia truly sat over fissures exhaling sweet vapors. Some swear by tales of ethylene drifting up from fault lines. Others insist the inspiration came from ritual, rhythm, and the sheer gravity of expectation. A chorus of soft footsteps and attendants appear, women with calm faces and tidy hair, silver bowls in hand, laurel wreaths balanced like half-crowns. They glance at the honey with polite curiosity. One of them, older than the rest, leans in and inhales, a smile tugging at her mouth. "Thyme," she says, "a bold year." The way she says it, you feel like you're presenting a vintage wine. Apollo's eyes light with the kind of satisfaction only a creator gets when someone tastes and understands. The high priest speaks with Apollo in tones too quiet to carry, though you catch a phrase here and there, offering novelty harmonious to the dod. And then the moment opens like a curtain. You and Apollo step forward to the inner threshold, where shadows hold the edges of everything. An attendant takes the bowl and places it upon a low table beside sacred objects, a branch of laurel, a small brazier, a dish of barley. The honey's color pools like captured sunlight. Even in dimness, it glows. There's a French story you once heard, more rumor than record, that the first temple here was fashioned by bees out of wax and feathers, a shimmering hive palace that sung in wind. Another variation claims the priestesses who served were called melisae, bees, for the sweetness of their speech and the order of their service. Whether metaphor or preserved memory, the association feels close and right as the honey sits quietly among the ritual tools. A soft vibration travels up through your sandals, then into your bones, like the meadow's hum has tunneled under the mountain to meet you. The attendant's footsteps withdraw, and a richer silence settles, the kind that has seams you can breathe between. There's the faintest rustle, like fabric over stone. You don't see the Pythia enter, you feel her presence arrive, as if calm itself has taken a seat. "Lord of the lute," she says, voice low and unhurried, "what have you brought me that I don't already hold?" The title lands like a feather, half teasing, half reverent. Apollo inclines his head just enough to acknowledge a colleague rather than a subject. "The meadow's patience," he says, distilled by small teachers. She laughs, a small, real sound that makes dust motes tremble. "Then share it." An attendant lifts a spoon of olive wood, dips it into the honey, and lets a ribbon fall into a clay cup. The Pythia tastes. There is a pause with weight to it, 2 heartbeats, maybe 3. She doesn't close her eyes, her gaze simply softens until it seems to look through the stone and into the thyme hills. "Gold that remembers flowers," she says finally. It speaks of orderly return. She gestures to the laurel, this branch, that branch, and something about sowing and gathering and keeping time with what is smaller than you. If this were a Yelp review, it would be 5 stars with a note about excellent mouthfeel, may cause existential reflection. Apollo offers the bowl fully now, not as a transaction, but as a joining. The attendants decant some honey into sanctuary jars, then hand back the rest with a new ribbon, purple this time, tied around the neck. "For the road," one of them murmurs, like a grandmother packing extra bread. As you turn to go, a young petitioner slips from the line to stare wide-eyed at the honey, then at you. "Does it change the prophecies?" he whispers, as if honey could rewrite fate the way sauce saves a dry stew. You crouch, balancing the bowl on one palm. "It makes listening easier," you say. "Sweetness can do that." He nods gravely, as children do when truth arrives wrapped like candy. Outside, sunlight spills back over you with the enthusiasm of a large dog. The sacred way looks friendlier now, softer round its edges. You descend past treasuries bright with offerings, past a sculpted charioteer whose bronze eyes watch everything and nothing. On a wall, someone has scratched a tiny bee in the mortar, a private joke or a prayer, or both. Apollo's mood is quiet and pleased. She heard the meadow, he says, more to himself than to you. He balances the bowl in one hand and idly plucks a string on his lyre with the other. Just one note, pure and bright, that seems to hang in the air long after the sound has gone. You're almost back to the steps when a courier breezes by, sandals slapping cheerfully against stone, a winged hat bobbing at a jaunty angle. He gives Apollo a grin so familiar you can feel the prank forming like weather. The courier vanishes uphill whistling. You and Apollo exchange a look. "Did you probably," he says, and the corner of his mouth lifts. You have the sense the story will acquire a rival with suspicious speed, and that the meadow honey has just been added to someone else's to-do list. Back in the light, the thyme breath of the hillside waits for you like an old friend. You can almost taste the Pythia's words still on your tongue, orderly return, like a hint of laurel carried on the wind. The bowl rides steady in your hands. You start down the path, past the olive groves, toward the hum that made this sweetness, and the little teachers who keep their own exacting schedule, entirely indifferent to prophecies, politics, or product launches. Although, for the record, Apollo proposes calling this batch Sunbeam Number 1. You recommend market testing. By the time the meadow opens before you, the bees are already sketching their maps in the warm air. The hive glows softly, cedar warmed to honey color, and the day folds itself around you with a comfortable sigh of work done, of gifts shared, of stories already drifting from temple steps to village hearths, where someone is probably saying, "You'll never guess what the sun god brought for the oracle," and someone else is answering, "Tell me after dinner."
You don't have to wait long for the Hermes-shaped cloud to materialize into a storm. The next morning, while you're coaxing a fresh basin of water into place near the hive, a flicker of movement catches your eye, something darting between olive trunks with the nimbleness of a fox that's learned to juggle. Hermes emerges into the meadow like he owns it, a grin already halfway to mischief. His sandals, trimmed with tiny golden wings, kick up little tufts of thyme. "I hear," he says without preamble, "you've been dabbling in apiculture." He makes the words sound like a private joke. Apollo, reclining on the boulder in that unbothered sun god sprawl, doesn't even look up from tuning his lyre. I prefer to think of it as cultivating sweetness. Hermes' eyes flick to you as if to confirm you've been drafted into this little rivalry. You nod reluctantly. "It's true, we have honey." "And I," Hermes declares, "have the superior recipe for divine sweets." He produces a small cloth pouch from nowhere. Seriously, you're certain his pockets are some kind of magical wormhole. And tips it open to reveal golden brown chunks, crystallized and fragrant. "Candied figs," he says, with a glaze of Mount Helicon honey. Historically speaking, candied fruits were a luxury in ancient Greece, made with honey or grape must syrup and often reserved for special occasions. A quirky tidbit, some sources suggest merchants in port cities used such sweets as bribes to secure better deals, which suddenly makes a lot of sense when you consider Hermes' portfolio includes trade, travel, and general trickery. Historians still argue whether these confections were common enough for everyday folk or strictly elite fare. Apollo finally looks up, plucks a few notes, and says, "Your figs are fine, I'm sure, but the thyme honey from my meadow is fit for prophecy." He gestures at the hive, where bees are lazily ferrying pollen like tiny golden couriers. Hermes doesn't miss a beat. "Then let's settle this. A contest. Your honey against my figs. Winner takes eternal bragging rights." His grin is infuriatingly confident. Before you can suggest maybe not roping bees into a divine ego match, Apollo is already agreeing. "1 week," he says, "we'll each prepare our finest creation, and the people will judge." You glance at the bees, who seem entirely unconcerned, continuing their loops between thyme and hive. If they know they've just been enrolled in a culinary competition, they're keeping it to themselves. The week passes in a haze of preparation. Apollo spends hours watching the bees work, occasionally humming in low tones he swears helps them produce notes of wild mint. You help harvest a smaller batch of comb, working carefully so as not to disrupt the main store. The air is rich with floral perfume, and your fingers are perpetually sticky. Hermes, for his part, pops into the meadow every couple of days, not to spy, he claims, but to check the weather. Each time he leaves with a handful of figs from somewhere, muttering about optimum ripeness like a man testing arrows for balance. By the final day, both camps are ready. The meadow has been transformed into a makeshift festival. Low tables draped in linen, amphora of water and wine, and an array of curious onlookers from nearby villages, drawn by the promise of free sweets and the novelty of watching two gods try to outdo each other. Apollo presents first, a simple clay dish of fresh bread rounds drizzled with his meadow honey, garnished with sprigs of thyme. The honey pools in the bread's warm hollows, glistening in the afternoon light. The first bite earns a murmur from the crowd. Soft bread, aromatic sweetness, and that little herbal echo. Hermes counters with his candied figs, sticky and jeweled, each bite yielding a burst of deep fruit tempered by honey's mellow richness. A child near the front immediately asks for more, cheeks bulging like a squirrel. Tasting becomes a quiet ritual. A piece of bread, a fig, a sip of water, and murmured debate. You catch fragments. The time stays with you. But the figs are a meal in themselves. What if we just ate both? In the end, no clear winner emerges. The crowd, diplomatic in the way only free food can inspire, declares both offerings equally worthy. Apollo and Hermes exchange looks. Apollo's amused, Hermes begrudgingly impressed. "Very well," Hermes says, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "I'll allow a draw. For now." He slips you a fig as he leaves, a conspiratorial wink thrown in for free. When the meadow empties and the last crumb's gone, you and Apollo sit beside the hive. The bees hum softly, unbothered by contests or verdicts, working toward their next cycle. "You know," you say, "they didn't care who won." Apollo smiles. "Exactly. Sweetness isn't meant to be measured, it's meant to be shared." Evening folds over the meadow like a robe laid carefully on a chair, and you settle beside the hive with your back against warm cedar, the day's last light pooling in the comb like trapped sunset. Apollo idly plucks his lyre, a thread of sound that barely disturbs the bees. "You've met their sweetness," he says, "but you should meet their stories." The way he says stories makes it sound like he's opening a door, not a conversation. He begins with a name that tastes like the thing itself, Melissa, bee. You picture a nymph with honey-brown hair and patient hands. Apollo tells you how Melissa fed infant Zeus with honey when hiding him from Cronus, and how her name spread like pollen through time, landing on priestesses and beekeepers alike. Melissae, he says, and the word hums, women whose duties braided sweetness with sacred work. Mainstream history supports his tone. Priestesses in places like Ephesus were indeed called Melissae, bees, serving Artemis beneath columns carved with buzzing symbolism. Coins from that city show a neat bee with crisp wings and dot-bright eyes. You imagine a market day there, clink of bronze and the quiet whisper of a coin stamp lifting to reveal another tiny winged citizen. You glance at the hive entrance. A few late workers drift home, their legs feathered with gold dust. Apollo's music softens. He follows the thread to Crete, where the Minoans buried wealth of shape and metal, including a famous pendant, two bees back to back meeting at a droplet of gold. They understood, he says, that plenty relies on partners. You think of that pendant's fine granulation, small beads fused to make filigree, an artisan's patience mirroring the hives.
A real-world fact as solid as the earth you're sitting on. Archaeologists found it at Malia, and even now it could teach a jeweler restraint and audacity at once. The grass cools under your palms. Tell me about Aristaeus, you say, because you've heard the name at feasts murmured like a remedy. Apollo smiles the way a parent does when someone remembers a child's best qualities. Aristaeus, he repeats, my son with Cyrene. The story moves like water in a stone channel. Aristaeus learned to keep hives. Then disaster. His bees died and he sought counsel. In some versions, he must appease angry nymphs. In others, he performs a strange rite, and from sacrifice rises a rebirth of bees, bougonia, the belief that bees spring from the body of a bull. You clear your throat. Creative, you say carefully. 3 jokes are the quota. You've used one with a gentle eyebrow. Apollo's eyes twinkle. Innovative, if impractical. His voice lowers. Historians still argue whether bougonia was earnest belief or the poetic overreach of people trying to explain a mystery with the pieces at hand. You nod. You've witnessed enough mornings here to know new life is quieter than legend and better smelling than bulls. A breeze travels through thyme and into the cedar, the hive answering with a tone shift too subtle for anyone but you to notice by now. Apollo watches your face and sees you've heard it. They keep time without clocks, he says, and therefore they keep story without parchment. He tells you that in some sanctuaries, honey sealed promises, dripped on altars or sweetened grain for offerings. Funerary customs used honey to anoint and to preserve. The phrase milk and honey wandered from banquet to boundary, describing lands of plenty and afterlives of ease. You think about sweetness at thresholds, birth, marriage, death, like a constant bass note under the melody of a life. He leans back and draws another line from myth to stone. At Delphi, he says softly, there are whispers that the first temple was built not of marble, but of beeswork, wax blended with feathers, the whole shimmering in the wind. He lets the image hang, a pale, living architecture that might melt, might sing. Then the caveat arrives, like the gentle closing of a door. Historians still argue whether that tale preserves a memory of small wax offerings multiplied in retelling, or if it is just a hymn given the shape of a building. Either way, you feel the kinship. Small pieces joined with patience, devotion turned into shelter. A beetle bumps your anvil and reverses with obvious professional embarrassment. This becomes joke 2, the tiniest slapstick. Even the local security is non-lethal, you murmur, and Apollo's laugh skims across the meadow. The bees ignore both of you. Above, the first star shows up early to the party, that one friend who likes to help fold napkins. Apollo tells you of places where oracles and bees brush wings. Some ancient writers hinted that priestesses, Melissae again, carried words like nectar, and that the hush that falls before a prophecy is a hive's hush, a mind warmth, a gathering. You remember the Pythia tasting your honey, her voice loosening into laurel and return. Gold that remembers flowers, she said, and now you hear the answering line, words that remember silence. Not all bee lore is temple-polished, Apollo adds, eyes glinting. He recounts a rural habit, telling the bees' family news, births, marriages, deaths, as if they were owed the courtesy. You picture a grandmother at a hive, voice soft, apron dusted with flour, informing the colony that little Nicandacros took his first steps, that the old olive tree has finally given up, that everyone will be fine and suppers at dusk. Quirky, yes, and somehow exactly right, given how these neighbors notice everything. Historians still argue whether such telling traveled from one region to another by trade routes or grew independently wherever people depended on hives. You suspect both can be true. Sweetness is excellent at networking. Your mind drifts to Ephesus again, to the bee-marked coins, and to Artemis, who wears many names and many mantles. The bee suits her priests, precise, communal, tireless. You ask Apollo if he minds that bees serve other deities, and he waves a hand, unbothered. A good worker may offer at many altars, he says. Sunlight does not sign exclusivity contracts. Joke 3 lands featherlight, and the meadow approves by doing nothing at all. He shifts to craft. Wax, he muses, the second gift. Candles are rare luxuries now, mostly for ritual, but wax goes everywhere, into tablets for writing and rewriting, into seals, into the patient work of lost wax casting, where a sculptor makes form in wax, wraps it in clay, fires it so the wax flows out like a spirit, and pours metal into the negative. You picture a bronze god being born from a bee's leftover labor, and it feels inevitable. Sweetness and form, flavor and memory, nothing wasted. Fact checks itself under your fingertips. You've watched a smith cradle a wax model like a loaf of bread. A night bird tries a few notes. The hive's hum lowers into something like a purr, or maybe your own breathing builds a duet. Apollo tells a final story, voice nearly a whisper. Some say, he begins, that when a poet falls asleep on a hillside, bees will visit, placing drops of honey on the lips to mark the mouth for gentleness. He smiles sideways. I prefer to supervise such initiations, but I admit delegation has its charms. You rub your lips absently, finding only time dust and the memory of bread. Silence lengthens in friendly fashion, like a cat along a windowsill. You trace circles on the cedar with one finger. The wood is warm still, but cooling, the line between day and night sliding along the grain. You think you'll remember this mixture of precision and myth, the way facts nest like cells in a comb and legends stretch between them like shared walls. It's not even a metaphor so much as the blueprint the mind likes to use: pattern, store, return, repeat. The first bats flicker above the olive tops. Apollo lays the lyre across his knees. Sleep, he says, not as an order, but as a forecast. They'll keep the pattern while you rest. You yawn, proof that mortal physiology respects good management. The bees murmur a lullaby made of machinery and meadow, and every tale he told turns to a soft, edible shape in your thoughts. You catch one more debate drifting through your head. Historians still argue whether the bee line is real or our desire to make nature run like a compass. But you let the argument go where all pleasant arguments go at dusk, somewhere far enough away to keep, close enough to visit later. You lean your shoulder against the hive. It leans back with a steady, living weight. The stars multiply, the stories settle into their cells, and the night, very politely, begins.
It starts with a sound you almost miss, a shift in the hive's hum, like a low note sliding upward. You've been around long enough now to know that the bees have distinct moods, and this one is new, sharper, restless. Apollo hears it too. He glances at you from where he's strumming his lyre, eyebrows lifting in a silent, "Do you hear that?" The morning air is still cool, carrying the scent of wet thyme and olive wood smoke from some distant hearth. A few bees are already out, but instead of their usual gentle loops, they're clustering near the entrance, bodies quivering. One takes off, then another, then 10 more in quick succession. They're swarming, you say, before you even think about it. Apollo straightens, sliding the lyre aside. Swarming? Historically speaking, swarming is a colony's way of reproducing itself. Half the bees, along with the old queen, leave to find a new home. It's a natural, healthy process, but to a beekeeper, it can feel like watching your tenants suddenly pack up and move without notice. A quirky tidbit: some ancient beekeepers tried to follow swarms by banging on pots or ringing bells, believing the noise encouraged the bees to settle nearby. Historians still argue whether this actually worked or just made the beekeeper feel less helpless. In the next breath, the air thickens with motion. The swarm pours from the hive in a golden brown cloud, the hum swelling until it fills the whole meadow. You blink against the movement, feeling the vibration in your chest more than your ears. Apollo's face shifts from surprise to focus, and then, without warning, he takes off running. "Come on," he calls over his shoulder. You scramble after him, ducking under olive branches and leaping over low shrubs, eyes on the swirling cloud ahead. The bees aren't fleeing in panic.
They're purposeful, moving together like a single fluid creature. The chase winds downhill, across a strip of rocky soil where your sandals scrape for purchase. You pass a pair of startled goats who clearly didn't sign up for this scene. Apollo, somehow, remains graceful even in a sprint, his golden hair catching the sunlight like a signal fire. The swarm veers towards a grove of olive trees, the kind planted centuries ago and left to twist into their own shapes. You catch up just as the bees begin clustering on a thick, low branch, forming a living curtain that sways with their weight. Apollo slows, breathing evenly, and approaches as though greeting a shy animal. You stop a few paces back, remembering that, divine or not, he did get stung once almighty. The cluster is mesmerizing, thousands of bodies moving over one another, yet holding together in a perfect oval. The sound is softer now, a steady, contented vibration. What now, you ask? Apollo tilts his head, studying the branch. We could leave them, he says, and they will find their own home, or we could invite them back. You half expect him to start singing to them, but instead he motions for you to wait and disappears into the trees. He returns a few minutes later with a wide-mouthed basket woven from reeds, lined with fresh thyme sprigs. He sets the basket beneath the cluster and, with a sudden, confident motion, shakes the branch. The bees drop in a shimmering wave, the weight hitting the thyme with a sound almost like rain. A few circle in protest, but most begin settling, crawling deeper into the basket. It's nerve-wracking work. Twice, bees crawl up Apollo's arm, and you fight the urge to brush them away. But within minutes, the majority are inside. Apollo covers the basket loosely with a linen cloth, allowing air but keeping them contained. Carrying them back is a slow, careful process. You walk behind him, ready to steady the basket if needed. The meadow feels different when you re-enter it, emptier, quieter. You realize how much of its life is bound up in that hum. Back at the hive, Apollo sets the basket at the entrance and gently shakes it so the bees tumble out in a golden spill. Some immediately take flight, orienting themselves with figure-8 loops. Others march inside like soldiers returning from campaign. By midday, the hum has returned to its usual register. Apollo sits on the boulder, legs stretched, watching the hive as if confirming each bee's re-entry. They'll remember this place, he says at last. Even if they leave again, they'll know where sweetness lives. You settle beside him, letting the adrenaline ebb. Do you think they left because of us? Apollo shakes his head. They left because it was time. All I did was remind them that home can wait. The meadow resumes its slow rhythm. Bees drift between thyme blooms, the sun leans toward afternoon. The brief chaos of the chase fades into memory, the kind you'll tell later with more breathless detail than it probably deserves. Still, when you close your eyes, you can see the swarm moving through the air, one body, one sound, and the image lingers as steady and alive as the hum beside you now.
The swarm episode seems to have lit a spark in Apollo's mind. For the next 2 days, he keeps circling back to one idea, tossing it into casual conversation like someone testing a pebble for weight. We should make something with the honey, something celebratory. By the 3rd repetition, you know he's not thinking about cakes or glazes. Sure enough, one afternoon he appears with a clay amphora and a bundle of herbs, eyes bright as a sunrise. "We're making mead," he announces, as if the decision has been ratified by the entire pantheon. The amphora is a deep-bellied vessel, its reddish clay still cool from the shade. The herbs are sprigs of rosemary, a handful of crushed thyme, and something else you can't identify. Apollo calls it sun's breath, which you suspect is just his branding for marigold petals. He sets them neatly beside a large bronze basin and gestures for you to fetch the honey. Historically speaking, mead is considered one of the world's oldest alcoholic drinks, made by fermenting honey with water, sometimes with herbs or fruits for flavor. In ancient Greece, it wasn't as common as wine, but it had an air of old-world mystique, tied in some myths to ambrosia itself. A quirky tidbit, some ancient writers claimed mead was the drink of choice for poets before wine took over the symposium scene. Historians still argue whether this was fact or just a romantic retro-branding of the beverage. You pour fresh honey into the basin, and it flows like molten amber, catching every beam of light. Apollo adds water from the stream, swirling it in smooth circles until the two merge into a golden sheen. The herbs go in next, their scent rising in green resinous waves. He stirs with a long wooden paddle, humming softly as if coaxing the flavors to mingle. Will this work, you ask, watching bubbles form at the edges? It will work, Apollo says, if we give it time. He covers the basin with a linen cloth and sets it in the shadow of the boulder, where the air stays warm but not scorching. Fermentation, he adds with a knowing smile, is just another way to measure patience. Over the next week, you check on it daily. The smell changes first, still sweet, but with a sharper note, like the difference between ripe fruit and the first hint of wine. A faint fizz forms on the surface, and Apollo tastes it with the cautious enthusiasm of a man testing a lyre string. Not yet, he says each time. On the 8th day, he declares it ready. You ladle the pale gold liquid into small clay cups, each cool to the touch. Apollo raises his in a toast. To the bees, he says, and to the humans clever enough to listen to them. The first sip is surprising, sweetness softened into something rounder, with a whisper of herbs and a faint warmth that blooms in your chest. It's not the sharp bite of wine, but a slow, mellow unfolding. You take another sip and feel your shoulders loosen. A few villagers happen to wander through the meadow, and Apollo waves them over. Soon, you've got a small circle sitting in the thyme grass, each with a cup in hand. There's laughter, someone starts a quiet song, and the bees go on working around you as if the gathering is just another flower in bloom. One older man swirls the mead in his cup, peering at it against the light. Haven't tasted this since I was a boy, he says, voice somewhere between nostalgia and approval. A young woman tilts her head after sipping. It's like drinking late summer, she says. Apollo beams, as if that's exactly what he was aiming for. You notice the amphora is empty far sooner than you expected. The mead has a way of disappearing between stories and second helpings. Apollo doesn't seem to mind. He just watches the cups empty, as if pleased the meadow's gift has found so many voices. When the sun starts to slip toward the hills, the villagers drift back toward their homes. Apollo gathers the empty cups, setting them in the stream to wash clean. Not bad for a first batch, he says. You grin. Are we making more? Oh yes, he replies, but next time, perhaps with pomegranate. The hive hums softly in the background, as though filing this new project into its own quiet ledger of the meadow's ongoing experiments. The mead has barely faded from everyone's memory before Apollo shifts gears entirely. One morning, as you're checking the hive's entrance for signs of early foragers, he's already perched on the boulder with a faraway look that means he's been thinking for a while. You know, he begins, beekeeping might be the best lesson the sun has ever given me. You arch an eyebrow. Better than archery, or prophecy, or that time you made an entire mountain glow for dramatic effect? He smiles faintly. Those are louder lessons. This one is quieter and perhaps longer lasting. You settle onto the grass, knees pulled up, waiting for him to go on. Apollo gestures toward the hive. Patience, he says first, and you can tell it's the cornerstone. You cannot rush a bloom, and you cannot rush a bee. They work in their time, and if you try to hurry them, you ruin the thing you're hoping for. Historically speaking, patience is a value many ancient writers attached to agriculture and craft. Hesiod, for instance, told farmers to follow the rhythm of the seasons rather than force them. Apollo's version is gentler, but carries the same truth. Cycles, he continues, they know them better than I do. I might command the day and night, but I don't decide when time flowers or when a queen lays. The hive does that. They keep their own calendar, written in scent and sunlight. You think of the days you've watched them, how certain patterns repeat. The slow mornings after a chill night, the frantic buzzing before rain, the calm of a heavy afternoon. Then he picks up a comb fragment from the flat rock beside him, turning it in his fingers. Small acts of creation, he says. One bee alone makes almost nothing, but together... He holds it toward you, and you see how every cell is perfectly formed, each one the size of a single bee's body length. Perfection in repetition. That's something worth imitating. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your mind. In some ancient philosophies, the bee was a model citizen, orderly, industrious, and devoted to the good of the whole. You tell him this, and he chuckles. And yet, he says, they still dance in the middle of work. They know joy doesn't wait for the day to end. You glance toward the hive, imagining the waggle dances happening in the dark interior. It makes you think of humans finding time for music even during planting or harvest, communal meals, songs at the press, laughter over shared labor. Apollo's expression softens. They've reminded me that power isn't always in command. Sometimes it's in care. I could scorch this meadow in a day, but keeping it alive is far more difficult and far more beautiful. You can't resist. So the god of the sun is taking life lessons from insects? He grins. From teachers smaller than my thumb. For a while, you both just sit, the hum of the hive wrapping around you like warm cloth. The sun filters through the olive branches, dappling the grass in shifting patterns. You've learned something too, he says suddenly. You blink. Have I? You've learned to be still, to listen without rushing to speak. I've seen you match their pace. You think about it and realize he's right. In the beginning, you were all questions and quick movements. Now you can sit for an hour and simply watch, letting the rhythm of the meadow soak into you. Historians still argue whether observation was truly valued in ancient Greek daily life or simply romanticized in later writings. But here, with the hive breathing steadily beside you, the value feels undeniable. Apollo sets the comb fragment back on the rock and leans back on his hands. When I leave, he says, I'll take these lessons with me, and when I return, I'll expect to learn more. You think the bees will teach you new things? He nods. Of course, they're never finished, and neither am I. The bees continue their steady work, each tiny journey a thread in the larger fabric of the hive's life. You watch one land, slip inside, and vanish into the cedar shadow. For a moment, you imagine what it would be like if humans moved with such certainty, such communal purpose. Maybe Apollo's right. Maybe the best lessons are the ones you can't rush, the ones that arrive on small wings and hum softly in your ear until you finally slow down enough to hear them.
The morning you give them away, the meadow smells like a bakery. Warm cedar, sun-kissed wax, and the faint herb sugar of thyme. Apollo has been awake since dawn, moving through the grass with the purposeful calm of someone tying ribbons on gifts that happen to hum. 3 small hives wait on the flat rock, each one polished, each with its own painted front so the bees can orient home at a glance. Brand recognition, he says lightly, and you cough to hide a laugh, thinking of Sunbeam number 1 and his eternal focus group of 2, you and the breeze. The first recipient arrives on a staff and steady sandals. Phaedon, the olive-wood old beekeeper whose silence says more than speeches. He peers at the smallest hive, nodding once, hands hovering just shy of the wood as if blessing it without smudging the finish. They'll sit by the almond trees, he decides. Early flowers, early honey. A plain fact tucks into the morning. Almonds do bloom early in Greece, a welcome nectar before other plants wake. Apollo listens as if the man has solved an equation he's been working for months. You remember Phaedon's warning, they are not yours, you are theirs, and see its echo in the care with which Apollo lifts the hive into the old man's arms. Payment? Phaedon asks with a glint you recognize as humor. Apollo shakes his head, smiling. Bring me patience when you have extra. That earns a rare, genuine snort. Joke 1,
Interest-free loans payable in virtues. Someone should alert Hermes. Next come two women from the village, sisters, hair pinned with bone combs, aprons dusted with flour. They introduce themselves as Anthy and Phi, bakers who want bees not for sweetness alone, but for wax to seal their honeyed barley cakes in traveling jars. You feel a small joy at the practical angle. Historically, beekeeping in the Greek world wasn't only a man's craft. Households depended on it, and women often handled the processing, straining, cooking, sealing. You and Apollo walk the sisters around the meadow, discussing placement, low stone wall for windbreak, water basin nearby, paint the entrance so returning foragers don't slip into a neighbor's living room. You mention, almost casually, the rural habit of telling the bees' family news. Anthy stores it instantly, the way bakers file oven timing in their bones. Will they know we are theirs? Phi asks, gaze soft. They will know you are the place where they are safe, Apollo answers. It lands in your ribs like a bell's note, plain and right. The third hive goes to a fisherman from the Gulf, skin salt-bronzed, hair curled by wind. Rooftop, he says, explaining that his house stands above the quay. Herbs thrive in pots up there, and breezes keep the air easy. You blink, rooftop bees? Then remember, in crowded towns, high hives keep peace with neighbors and give bees clear flight lanes. He adds, with the matter-of-fact pride of someone who's tested it, that sea breezes make strong flyers. A quirky tidbit bubbles up. Some Mediterranean keepers, centuries later, would even move hives seasonally, chasing blooms. Egyptians floated clay hives on the Nile atop barges to follow clover, mobile sweetness long before food trucks. Historians still argue whether Greek keepers adopted any form of nomadic practice this early, or if that mobility belonged mostly to their neighbors downriver. You picture a bee barge anyway, striped awning, tiny mooring ropes, and decide the mental image is worth the scholarly footnote. You spend the rest of the day playing gentle logistics manager. The sisters' hive rides home on a handcart, cushioned with fresh straw. Phaedon balances his with the unshowy grace of decades. The fisherman hoists his like a chest and waves, promising to send a jar when the thyme turns to citrus. Apollo walks each group as far as the olive grove, then stops with the restraint of a god learning about boundaries, watching until there's specks on the path. At each gate, there's a small ceremony of nothing fancy. A twig of laurel tucked into the hive seam, a splash from the stream to dampen the dust, a quiet sentence offered to the bees like a weather report in a kind voice. Here is your new home, you murmur at one threshold, and the words feel less like instruction than permission. You add a bowl of pebbled water, the tiny landing stones prevent drownings, a fact you learned the sticky way. And Apollo, approving, makes a note to carve smoother basins next time. By midday, you're in the village, guiding Anthy and Phi through first tasks. A corner of their yard becomes a miniature of the meadow. A low wall for shelter, a shard of blue paint on the entrance board so returning foragers can pick their door in a blur. A neighbor appears with a sprig of rosemary for the new tenants, and someone joke too, that the bees will expect a rent discount if the rosemary bolts early. The yard smells like bread, warm and steady. You imagine a future loaf glossed with their own honey, sealed under their own wax, handed across a counter with the pride of a closed circle. In the afternoon, you climb a groaning ladder to the fisherman's roof. He's already set terracotta pots of marigold and marjoram, bright as pennants, and a wind chime made from shell crescents that tinkle, unhelpfully, you suspect, every time a gust decides to show off. You stand together and watch the first scouts test the air, push out over the harbor, and wheel back like skippers practicing tight turns. They'll read the shoreline, the fisherman says with confidence. You believe him. The hive's hum takes on a new accent, gull cry braided through time memory. And it occurs to you that terroir isn't only roses and soil, it's wind and routine too. Historians still argue whether ancient consumers could truly taste region in honey, Attic versus Thasian versus Hymettus, or whether prestige and poetry did half the work. Your tongue votes yes, your skepticism votes maybe, your heart votes who cares, pass the bread. Back up the road, you find Phaedon under his almond trees, already doing what he does best, nothing hurried. He's placed the hive so morning light arrives like a polite knock, afternoon shade like a cool hand. He taps the entrance with one knuckle, two, soft, and says, not to you, I am home when you are. You catch him place a small ribbon on a branch nearby, black with a narrow white edge. For my wife, he says after a moment. She would have liked this hum. You remember the old custom, telling the bees of death so sweetness isn't startled by sorrow, and feel the yard grow both lighter and fuller. He spreads a pinch of barley flour by the basin, extra food for early spring, and you store the trick for your own ledger of useful kindness. By late light, the village wears new sounds, a small, unfamiliar hush hovering over certain corners like held breath. Children get walked past at a dignified pace, look but don't tap, while older neighbors stand with arms folded and memories unfolding. Someone mentions clay tube hives their grandfather used. Someone else swears their aunt once swore the bees paused to listen when she sang at laundry. Historians still argue whether bees respond to particular pitches or simply to the calm in a singer's body, but you decide not to referee. You just listen, which is half the craft anyway. On your way back, Hermes ambles out of a side street, inspecting a loaf dripping with someone else's honey. He raises it like a toast. Diversifying the market, I see? You tell him there's no market, just more breakfasts that don't need a second argument. He winks and pockets a comb you honestly did not see him acquire. Joke 3, call it a delivery fee in advance of theft. When the meadow returns beneath your sandals, the original hive meets you with its ordinary music, as if to say, good, you've multiplied our patience instead of hoarding it. Apollo sits on the boulder, looking not triumphant, but relieved. They'll keep sweetness, he says, when I'm elsewhere making sunsets behave. The muses wander through late, dropping off a basket of nettles and a poem title you both forget instantly. The Pythia will taste village jars in weeks to come, and say again that line about orderly return. And somewhere on a rooftop above the harbor, a fisherman will fall asleep to a hum blended with rigging creaks and wake to bread brushed with gold. You leaned against the cedar and think of how gifts move best, from hand to hive to hand again, less a straight line than a gentle circuit, like the way bees leave and come home, until the leaving has taught the coming back how to shine. The meadow keeps the proof in its quiet ledger, wax added, names learned, doors painted, and the evening writes a check mark in pink across the hill. You and Apollo breathe with the hive, and the village hum returns to you on the wind, a chorus of small kitchens practicing patience together.
The day tilts toward evening, and the meadow seems to notice before you do. The thyme gives off its last strong breath, a little sharper now in the cooling air, while the olive branches click together softly like lazy castanets. The bees who have been darting through the light all afternoon are starting to return in steady, purposeful lines, their legs laden with the day's gold dust. Apollo is already seated on the boulder, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the hive, like someone watching a beloved play reach its final act. You join him without a word, easing down until your hip brushes the warm stone. The cedar of the hive glows faintly in the sunset, each panel catching a different shade, honey here, amber there, a deep bronze shadow in the corners. They're almost in, Apollo says quietly. You can hear it, the pitch of the hum dropping as the workers slip inside, the air around the meadow loosening. It's like the exhale after a long-held note. A few stragglers arrive late, zigzagging in over the thyme patch, wings catching the orange light like tiny sails. You track one all the way to the entrance and find yourself smiling at the little stagger it makes before disappearing into the darkness of the hive. Historically speaking, beekeepers in Greece often kept watch at this hour, noting which hives returned heavy with pollen and which seemed sluggish. It was both a ritual and a record-keeping method,
An ancient audit minus the paperwork. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Some beekeepers even whispered a good night to their hives, believing it kept the colony content. Historians still argue whether this was practical husbandry or just another way humans fold affection into work. Apollo doesn't whisper, but he hums, a slow, winding tune that feels like it's meant for both you and the bees. The melody doesn't have a clear beginning or end, it just drifts, as if it's been playing in the meadow forever, and you're only catching it now. The last real rush of wings fades. Inside, you can hear a faint, more private hum, the hive's night voice, quieter, closer to a purr than the daytime's busy drone. The air is thick with warmth and the scent of wax, and you feel your own breathing match the slow rhythm of the place. Apollo leans back on his palms. "When I first saw them," he says, "I thought I'd be their keeper, but it turns out they've been keeping me." You glance at him, half expecting the grin that follows a joke, but there isn't one. His gaze stays on the hive, the lines of his face softer than the sunset behind him. A night breeze stirs, lifting the ends of your hair and carrying a swirl of mixed scents. Thyme, laurel from somewhere down the slope, a faint salt tang drifting up from the gulf. The first bat flits overhead, quick and silent. Somewhere beyond the meadow, a shepherd calls his dog home, the voice faint but clear. The hive is still now, save for the occasional shift of movement within, like a sleeper adjusting under blankets. You feel an odd urge to protect this moment, as if any loud thought might startle it away. Apollo stands slowly, stretching like a cat. "Tomorrow they'll begin again," he says, "and so will we." You rise with him, both of you looking out over the meadow. The hills are brushed in lavender shadows, the sky deepening toward indigo. The hive sits steady at your side, a warm, living ember against the cooling air. You stay there until the first true stars blink awake, each one sharp and steady, mirroring the little golden eyes that have just closed inside the hive. And when you finally turn toward the path, you carry the hum with you, quiet, patient, eternal.